Let's talk about Ed Feser's neo-Platonic proof, or what I like to call the argument from composition. The gist of the argument is, there are lots of things in the world that are made up of parts. But if even one thing is made up of parts, then there has to be something that's causing those parts to be unified into a whole. And if there's something unifying those parts into a whole, well then there's something that's causing the existence of the whole, because the whole would not exist if it weren't for the union of the parts. That union of the parts is explaining the existence of the whole. But what if it turns out that this sustainer of the parts' combinedness itself is made up of parts? Well then there has to be another sustainer of its parts' combinedness, right? There's obviously a whole causal series here. What kind of a causal series is it? Well, Feser thinks it's a hierarchical causal series, because if any one cause in this series were to stop exercising its causal power, then the whole subsequent portion of that causal series would just go away. They would not be able to keep exercising the powers that they do. For example, if whatever holds together the atoms that make up a rock were to stop holding together those atoms, then the rock would cease to exist entirely. Or if whatever holds together the subatomic particles that make up the atoms that make up the rock were to stop holding together those subatomic particles, then the atoms would cease to exist, and so the rock would as well, because there would be no atoms to make up the rock. But as we've discussed in other videos, Feser thinks that hierarchical series like this have to terminate with the first member. And if that's the case, well, what is this first member going to be like? It's going to be something that's not made up of parts, obviously, because if it were, then it would have to have another cause of the holding together of its parts. Okay, so each of these hierarchical series terminates with something that isn't made up of parts. So there's something in the world that's not made up of any parts. Fair enough, Feser. But so what? Naturally, an atheist or naturalist is just going to reply that there are elementary particles that are not made up of smaller parts. These are things like quarks and leptons, which include electrons, which are actually points that are completely dimensionless. So they they have no spatial extension, although they have spatial locations. And if there are these physical things that can terminate the hierarchical series of composition that we've been talking about, then we don't need to appeal to anything like God or pure act or whatever that Thomists want to bring into the picture. I realize there are some hardcore metaphysicians who might push back on physicists' usual claim that elementary particles are absolutely fundamental, because they'll say, wait, how do you know that these particles aren't made up of smaller particles? I mean, couldn't matter just be gunky? That is, couldn't every physical particle be made up of even smaller physical particles? I mean, it seems like we just keep finding smaller and smaller particles that make up every particle that we once took to be fundamental. So why couldn't that just keep going on forever? Or if it stops at some point, maybe that's a limit to our ability to divide the particles rather than a limit to how many particles there are making up other particles. Let's just bracket off that whole debate, though, because I think that would get pretty messy. I'd rather just suppose, for the sake of argument, that there are these absolutely fundamental physical particles like leptons and quarks. So given that, what does Feser have to say in response? He actually introduces a distinction between two different kinds of parts. One is physical parts, or parts like subatomic particles that occupy some of the space that's occupied by the whole. The other kind of parts, though, is metaphysical parts. And these include things like essence, existence, actuality, potentiality. These things don't have to occupy any space or be detectable by the senses or anything like that. What this means is that even an electron, which can't be broken down into smaller physical parts, has parts, namely metaphysical parts. I mean, surely an electron has an essence, existence, actuality, potentiality. I mean, it has the essence of an electron, if there is such an essence, and arguably there is, if there are such things as essences at all, to be more specific. Seems like electrons are essentially negatively charged, and they're essentially particles. And of course, electrons are both actual and existent, so they have actuality and existence. And they have the potential to go from being spin up to being spin down, or vice versa, as I understand it. Thomas will conclude from all of this that not only does an electron have existence, actuality, potentiality, actuality, and essence, but it has those things as parts, or undetectable constituents. Here's a related passage from page 73 of Feser's 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. Thomist philosophers hold that we can distinguish between the essence of a thing and its existence, that is, between what the thing is and the fact that it is. There is, for example, the essence or nature of a triangle being a closed plane figure with 3 straight sides, and the existence of some particular triangle, which differs from the existence of some other particular triangle. Now, a thing exists at all only as a thing of some kind or other, so that there is no such thing as the existence of a triangle, to stick with that example, apart from the essence of the triangle. Now notice how Feser makes a step here from there being a kind that any given thing falls under to there being an essence that the thing has. It seems like what he's saying is that in order to be a member of a kind, you have to have an essence that characterizes that kind. And that seems pretty plausible in a mathematical case like triangles. Triangles are given a very precise, clean-cut definition by mathematicians. So in order for something to count as a triangle at all, according to our concept of a triangle, it has to exemplify certain essential properties that we have specified in our statement of the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a triangle. But when it comes to things like games, to give an example that Wittgenstein uses, or things like biological species, it's not at all as clear that a thing has to have an essence in order to fall under a kind. Because it seems like there are kinds of organisms and kinds of games, or kinds of things that qualify as games, that aren't unified by an essence so much as family resemblances, to use a Wittgensteinian concept. If you were to look at all of the different members of these kinds, they would be related in somewhat the same way that the members of a family are. Any 2 members will have some significant number of things in common, but that doesn't mean that there's any one quality that all of the members have in common. Well, let's just grant for now that there are these essences that define kinds. Then where does Feser want to go with this? Well, let's continue the passage on page 73. The essence of a triangle all by itself, and apart from any actual triangle which has that essence, is a mere abstraction rather than a concrete object. So, some particular concrete triangle's essence has no reality apart from the triangle's existence. The essence and existence of a thing depend on one another in such a way that if there were no cause outside of the thing that accounts for how the essence and existence are conjoined, we would have an explanatory vicious circle. To understand what I just read, it helps to have an idea of Feser's Metaphysics of Abstract Objects, which he explains on page 102 of his book. His metaphysics is called Scholastic Realism, and what motivates this view, before I explain what it is the idea that there are certain abstract objects or universals, like propositions, that would obviously exist even if no material worlds or human minds existed. So, for example, the proposition that there is no material world and there are no human minds would be true, and so would exist and have the property of being true, um, even if there were no material worlds and no human minds. And so then it seems like um, this proposition can't be anything inside of the material world or inside of our minds. So it can't be identified with anything like any of our concepts or any of our beliefs or any particular things in the material world that are made up of atoms and whatnot. So the view that Feser proposes in order to explain how it is that these propositions can be true and exist, even though there is no material world or human mind out there, he says that these things exist in the mind of God, who exists necessarily, of course. So even if there were no humans, no matter, God would still exist, and so his intellect would exist. And so Feser wants to say that what these abstract objects are, or abstractions are just ideas in the mind of God. Here's how that theory clarifies what Feser was saying in the last paragraph on page 73. So he was saying that essences are universals because they're not wholly present in any one of their instances. For example, the essence of a triangle is kind of in two places at once, or many places at once, because it's wherever any particular triangle is, it's instantiated. And so it's a universal rather than any particular thing or triangle. But if that's the case, then it must be an idea in God's mind on this particular on the Thomistic metaphysics of abstract objects. But if what I just said were true of all essences, then you wouldn't need to appeal to the existence of a particular triangle to explain the existence of an essence of a triangle. Because the essence exists as a universal or an idea in God's mind, even if there is no actual triangle that exists as a particular thing in the world. God could be thinking about triangles or have the concept of triangles, even though there are no such things out there in the world. But Feser wants to argue, of course, that the existence of a triangle partly explains the essence of the triangle. So he has to draw a distinction between two kinds of essence, and one is the universal kind, whereas the other is the particular essence of a thing, like a particular concrete triangle's essence. Now for me, this just raises the question, why should we think there are these two different kinds of essence rather than just the universal essence? If there's just the universal essence, then there's no explanatory link or dependence relation between these two, the essence and the existence of the triangle. If there's only one kind of essence, namely the universal kind, then the existence of that essence doesn't depend at all on the existence of a particular triangle. So part of Feser's argument just doesn't work. Moreover, if the essence of a triangle is just something in God's mind, an idea, then clearly it's not a part, even a metaphysical part, of particular triangles, because particular triangles don't have divine ideas as something intrinsic to them or within them. They are within God. Nothing within God is plausibly within a triangle. Now, there's no denying that if there are such things as triangles at all, then they are instances of the universal essence of a triangle. They all have the attributes that are essential to a triangle. But it seems to me that there doesn't have to be such a thing as a particular essence. Rather, there just have to be particular things that all stand in the right relation to the universal essence. They all have to satisfy the descriptions or content underlying God's idea of a triangle. Suppose, for the sake of argument, though, that Feser is right that there are particular concrete essences, and that a thing has to have a particular concrete essence in order to fall under a kind of thing that's characterized by the essence in question. Then how does Feser's argument fare? Well, there are still a few objections that can be made, and one is that he makes this assumption that a thing has to fall under a kind in order to exist at all. One kind of thing or another it has to fall under. And I just think that's not that plausible if we assume, like Feser does, that there is some existence, namely God, that doesn't have to be a kind of thing in order to exist. Because it's not a kind of thing, it's not a thing at all. And if that's the case, then, well, why can't there be a thing that doesn't fall under a kind but still exists? My second objection is that Feser is not properly distinguishing between dependence and explanation here. He's arguing that there is an explanatory vicious circle between essence and existence, but the way he does that is by showing that there's a circle of dependence. In particular, he argues that a thing can't exist at all unless it falls under a certain kind, and in order to fall under a certain kind, it has to have a certain essence, a particular concrete essence. So, if that's the case, of course, it's true that if there's no particular essence, then there's also no existence of the particular thing. But that's just to say that the existence of the thing depends on the essence of the thing. It's not to say that the essence explains the existence of the thing. Likewise, he argues that if there were no existence of the particular thing, there wouldn't be an essence of it, because we're talking about particular concrete essences, not the universal essence that exists in the divine mind, whether or not the thing actually exists in the world. So think about it. If there were no particular concrete thing, well, then there wouldn't be the particular concrete essence either, right? It seems like that's the case. But what he's arguing is, again, that the essence of the thing depends on the existence, which is not to say that the existence explains the essence. Here's why I think we have to distinguish between dependence and explanation. Clearly, whether I exist depends on whether I exist. If I didn't exist, then I wouldn't exist. And that's the same sort of relation that Feser is arguing holds between essence and existence. But clearly, my existence doesn't explain my own existence. That would be a circular explanation, which is not an adequate explanation at all. Now, of course, Feser isn't saying that something explains its own existence exactly. Rather, he's saying that the essence of a thing explains the existence, and the existence explains the essence, and thus the circle. So why can't we just say my worry doesn't apply when it comes to dependences between distinct things? Well, here's an example of distinct things that depend on each other, but don't seem to explain each other. While I do exist, I'm not identical to my existence. I have existence, but I wouldn't say I am my existence. Still, there is a dependence relation, a circular one, between me and my existence. Because if I didn't exist, then neither would my existence. And if my existence didn't exist, then neither would I. Now, clearly this dependence is not explanatory, because I don't explain my own existence, and my own existence doesn't explain me. The reason I don't causally or metaphysically explain myself, and my existence and myself don't causally or metaphysically explain each other, is that in neither of these cases does the proposed explanation actually help you to understand the thing that's to be explained. It doesn't remove your puzzlement as to why that thing to be explained is the case. If I ask, why do I exist, and you respond by telling me that it's because I exist, well, that doesn't give me any new information, and so I'm still just as puzzled as to why I exist as I was when I originally asked the question. So in order to determine whether the circle of dependences that Feser identifies is a genuine explanatory circle, we have to consider whether there is this removal of puzzlement in the explanations that Feser is proposing. I can kind of see how Feser's proposed explanation of the triangle's existence works, because if I ask the question, why is there such a thing as this particular triangle's existence? And Feser answers, as he does, by saying that there is this triangle's essence. He gives me some new information. It's not just a restatement of the fact that there is the existence of that triangle, and the fact that the triangle exists is not contained in the thing that he's saying in order to explain it. It's not presupposed by the thing that's proposed as an explanation, because that particular essence could exist without the particular thing existing. The particular thing doesn't exist unless it has its accidents in addition to its essence. So the explanation doesn't presuppose the thing to be explained. Because of that, I can see how maybe Feser's explanation removes puzzlement a bit as to why there is the existence of the triangle. But I'm a little bit skeptical that it fully explains it, but I don't think that he would claim that the existence of the triangle is fully explained by there being the essence of the triangle. I guess the reason that it seems to remove a bit of my puzzlement as to why there is such a thing as the triangle's existence is that it tells me how that thing falls under a particular kind of thing. And by doing that, it explains how that thing exists at all, because like Feser says, and like I'm granting, a thing has to fall under a kind in order to exist at all. But the explanation that Feser offers for the triangle's essence is not quite as satisfactory, I would say, and that's because it does seem like the thing that he's proposing to explain it, which is the existence of the triangle, presupposes the essence. Clearly, part of what it is for this particular triangle to have existence is for it to have its particular concrete essence. So, by explaining the particular concrete essence in terms of the particular thing's existence, he's appealing to something that presupposes the very thing he's trying to explain. My third objection is that the particular concrete triangle's existence doesn't depend as strongly as Feser seems to think on that triangle's particular concrete essence. Remember that every particular triangle has its own particular concrete essence. So this particular triangle has its own particular concrete essence, which is not the same as that other triangle's particular concrete essence. What if this triangle's particular concrete essence were replaced by that triangle's particular concrete essence? Would the first triangle's existence cease to be? It might depend on what exactly we mean by the particular concrete essence of this triangle and that triangle. If we're talking about the particular concrete essence of a triangle that each one of them has, well, it seems like this triangle's particular concrete essence and that triangle's particular concrete essence have to include all the same attributes that are essential to all triangles. But if what we mean by this and that particular triangle's particular concrete essences is not just their essences, as in their instantiations of the universal essence of a triangle, but also the things that make them this and that triangle, then by interchanging the two things' essences, you're changing that thing, this triangle, into that triangle, it would seem, or at least it's going to cease to be this triangle because it no longer has the essence of this triangle. But if that's all there is to a triangle's particular concrete essence, then it seems like if it trades a particular concrete essence with another triangle, then its existence does not cease to be, because it still ends up with all the same attributes. My fourth and final worry is that even if Feser is right that there is this explanatory vicious circle, then his solution to it, his proposed way of breaking out of it, just doesn't work. he posits this explanation of the essence and existences being conjoined, but for one thing, that does nothing to help explain why there is the essence and why there is the existence. It helps to explain why there is the thing of which they are the essence and existence, perhaps, because that thing is composed of the essence and existence, and so it helps to explain why there is that composite. But it doesn't help explain the essence or existence themselves. Presumably, what we need is something to help us explain why there is the essence or existence, because the essence is failing to explain the existence, and the existence is failing to explain the essence, because they only explain each other in a very circular way. Moreover, since Feser already accepts that there is this explanatory vicious circle, there's nothing he can do to break out of it. He tries to propose that there's this thing that's helping out with the explanation, presumably. So the idea is there's this additional thing that adds to the explanation that's already going on between the essence and existence. The existence doesn't explain the essence on its own, rather the existence is partly explaining the essence. And then there's this other thing outside that aids in the explanation of the essence, and the same is true in the other direction, presumably. But that doesn't get rid of the vicious circularity, because Feser is still saying that existence partly explains essence, which partly explains existence, and the same is true in the other direction. Essence partly explains existence, which partly explains essence, and so things are partly explaining themselves, which seems like a problem. It was kind of a long time ago, so let me remind you that I got into this whole discussion of metaphysical parts because I thought it was the best, or maybe the only, reply that Feser could give to the naturalistic or atheistic objection that all these hierarchical series of things composing other things could just terminate with a physical thing that has no other physical parts, like an electron, because electrons are dimensionless. They don't have anything smaller that's making them up. Not too long after I took the discussion in this direction, I realized that there's a perfectly good alternative reply available to Feser, which is that at every stage in this hierarchical series, there's not just the parts and the whole that they compose, but there also is the thing that's joining the parts. And so if the atheist is going to reply that every physical thing has these perfectly simple parts, that's not going to be sufficient to terminate the regress. They will also have to argue that there is something that's nothing like God, but that joins these perfectly simple physical parts and is itself perfectly simple, or else the regress will go on forever. I have a bunch of thoughts on how to address this, but I don't feel like they're sufficiently organized or developed yet, so I'm going to wait to share them.